Today we're tackling a really fascinating period of history, this shadowy struggle for empire in Central Asia that got called The Great Game. We're diving into Peter Hopkirk's incredible book, The Great Game, The Struggle for Empire in Central Asia. And our goal here is pretty straightforward. Pull out the key insights, the really surprising facts straight from Hopkirk's perspective, basically give you a shortcut to understanding this epic conflict, focusing on the details he highlights about strategy and, well, the human element too.
It really was an epic stage. I mean, the sheer scale of it. Think of a chessboard stretching from the Caucasus Mountains, right across deserts and mountains, all the way to Tibet. And the players. You had these incredibly driven British and Russian officers, explorers, spies, generals, all maneuvering. And the big prize, the thing everyone was ultimately focused on, was British India.
It's fascinating, too, how we still hear the term new great game today, right? For the competition in Central Asia now.
Exactly. It shows it's not just dusty history.
Not at all. It's an echo, a continuation of this very old struggle. So when we think great game, we usually jump straight to the 19th century, Britain versus Russia. But Hopkirk, he argues we need to go back much further, right? To really get Russia's motivation.
That's right. He takes us centuries back to something pretty cataclysmic for Russia, the Mongol invasions, back in the 13th century, 1219 to 1240. He argues that this experience, it wasn't just a military thing. It left this deep, abiding fear of encirclement in the Russian psyche. And that, he says, fueled this relentless drive, pushing east and south into Asia for centuries. It was Ivan the Terrible, much later in the 16th century, who really kicked things off by taking Kazan and Astrakhan, those last Mongol strongholds. That sort of opened the floodgates for Russia's huge colonial expansion.
Okay, that makes sense as a long-term driver. So how does this centuries-old push connect specifically to Peter the Great and then eventually drag India into the picture? Because his vision in the early 1700s was, well, ambitious.
Ambitious is putting it mildly. Peter the Great was obsessed with modernizing Russia, catching up with Europe, building a powerful army, and he needed money. Lots of it. His big idea: grab the legendary riches he thought were in India and also gold from Central Asia, specifically the Oxus River region. It was a bit fantastical.
Sounds like it. And it didn't go well, did it, this Khiva expedition?
Oh, it was a disaster. 1717, Prince Alexander Bekovich leads 4,000 men out there, but the Khan of Khiva completely betrayed them. Bekovich was butchered, his head put on display, gruesome stuff. And Hopkirk really emphasizes this point, this early brutal defeat. It was a searing lesson for Russia, but also the memory of it and later finding Russian slaves there became this recurring justification, an excuse for pushing back into Central Asia later on.
Okay, so Russia learns a hard lesson early on. Then fast forward early 19th century, Napoleon enters the scene. How does he suddenly change the dynamics of this game way out in Central Asia?
Well, Napoleon was riding high, right, after successes in Europe. And he cooked up this, frankly, breathtaking plan in 1807. He proposed sending 50,000 French soldiers across Persia and Afghanistan to team up with Tsar Alexander for a joint invasion of India.
50,000 troops overland. Seriously.
Seriously. Though it wasn't the first crazy idea like that. Tsar Paul I, back in 1801, had this equally wild plan for 35,000 Cossacks to just march across Turkestan. He even had a schedule. 4 months to the Indus.
That sounds completely unrealistic.
Exactly. And Hopkirk points out that even Napoleon, wasn't naive about the challenges. He questioned how they'd manage supplies and logistics across what he called a barren and almost savage country. 1,000-mile march, basically.
So maybe more political threat than real military possibility. But still, for Britain, with India suddenly being talked about as a target, how did they react?
Oh, they reacted fast.
Yeah.
Very fast. Back in 1800, they sent Captain John Malcolm to Persia. His mission was crucial. Get a defensive treaty with the Shah. Specifically, the treaty aimed to keep the French and the Afghans out of Persia, creating a buffer.
Okay, makes sense. But alliances were shifting all the time in Europe then, weren't they?
That's the tricky part. Later, Britain and Russia actually ended up allies against Napoleon. So Britain found itself in this awkward spot, basically having to ignore Persia's pleas for help when Russia started grabbing territory in the Caucasus, like Georgia in 1801, or attacking Yerevan. Their European alliance sort of trumped their Persian strategy for a while.
Right, caught between a rock and a hard place. So this game wasn't just about treaties and armies. It was also about these incredibly brave, maybe crazy individuals going undercover, wasn't it? Tell us about Christie and Pottinger.
Absolutely. Captain Charles Christie and Lieutenant Henry Pottinger in 1810. Their mission was pure espionage, deep behind potential enemy lines. They disguised themselves as Tartars, claiming to be Muslim pilgrims to gather intelligence about the tribes, the terrain, how defendable the routes were. This was unbelievably dangerous. Strangers were deeply suspect. Their lives depended entirely on keeping that cover.
I can't even imagine the stress. What details really stand out from their journey? Anything particularly ingenious or dangerous?
Well, get this. Pottinger had a compass, right? Vital for mapping. But to avoid suspicion, he pretended it was a Qibla Numa, a device Muslims use to find the direction of Mecca for prayers. Whenever he needed a bearing, he'd make a show of finding Mecca.
That's brilliant. Resourceful.
Totally. And the dangers were constant. They uncovered planned ambushes by Afghan fighters, got caught in blinding sandstorms, even stumbled into a village taken over by murderous bandits who just, left a young boy to his fate. Horrifying stuff. Pottinger ended up traveling 900 miles across these awful deserts. But the key thing he realized, the intel he brought back, was that these natural barriers, they're actually, as he put it, extremely welcome news for defending India. They made a large invasion incredibly difficult.
So these guys were true pioneers of the game. What happened to them in the end?
Christie's story is tragic. He died just 2 years later in 1812, actually leading Persian infantry he trained against the Russians in the Caucasus. But for Britain, the bigger picture shifted dramatically that same year. Napoleon invaded Russia.
His great mistake.
Exactly. His catastrophic failure there completely removed the immediate threat of any joint Franco-Russian move on India. Huge relief in London and Calcutta, you can imagine. It bought Britain valuable time.
So the Napoleonic threat recedes, but that underlying tension between Britain and Russia, it doesn't go away, does it? It sounds like things actually started getting worse. The geopolitical barometer, as Hopkirk puts it, started falling. Why?
Yeah, the alarm bells really started ringing in Britain again around 1819, 1820. This is because of Captain Muraviev's mission to Khiva. It was a really daring trip. He went disguised as a Turkoman merchant. He actually got captured, thrown into this squalid fort, and there he made this shocking discovery. Russian citizens being held as slaves. Some had been there for 30 years.
30 years?
Yeah. He eventually met the Khan, got out, and reported back to the Tsar. And Hopkirk makes it clear. This news, the plight of Russian slaves, became the perfect excuse, a powerful justification for Moscow's later expansion into Central Asia. They could frame it as a liberation mission.
A convenient justification, perhaps. So while Russia is finding reasons to push south, what's Britain doing? How are they trying to counter this, or at least keep tabs on it?
Well, Britain had its own people poking around, often unofficially, like William Moorcroft. He was actually a veterinary surgeon, supposedly looking for good breeding horses in Central Asia in the 1820s. But he was doing a lot more than that. Huge amounts of unofficial exploration, as Hopkirk calls it. And Moorcroft developed this, near paranoia about Russia's intentions. He even tried to make his own treaty with Ladakh, a commercial one, which Calcutta immediately said no way to. He faced attempts on his life too. But he achieved some major firsts for Britain, first Englishman to see the Oxus River, first to reach the ancient Buddhist site of Bamiyan. He was gathering vital intelligence, even if off the books. But the bigger picture was darkening. That earlier treaty, Gulistan, in 1813, was clearly just a pause button. Russia grabbed more land in the Caucasus. Then the Russian ambassador, Griboyedov, was murdered in Persia, which really inflamed things. And by the late 1820s, Russia had beaten both Persia and Turkey in wars. Their generals were openly talking about war with Britain being inevitable. The barometer wasn't just falling, it was plummeting towards a storm.
So the stakes are just getting higher and higher, and it sounds like the game itself gets, dirtier. More spies, more risks, and more tragic endings.
Absolutely. This is when Captain Arthur Conolly enters the story. He's the guy credited with actually coining the phrase, the great game. He was on missions in the 1830s, recommending disguises, maybe a doctor, maybe a poor merchant, though he himself got captured, which shows you the risks. His key analysis, though, was about Afghanistan. He stressed that Britain needed a strong, united Afghanistan friendly to them as the essential buffer against Russia.
A buffer state.
Yeah.
And then came Alexander Burnes, right? Bukhara Burnes. He becomes almost legendary, but his story ends badly, too.
Yeah, Burnes was quite the character. Really meticulous, daring explorer. On a visit to Ranjit Singh in Lahore in 1831, he actually hid his money, his letter of credit, by sewing it into his arm like a charm.
No way.
Yep. His journey to Bukhara made him famous. He even met a Russian slave there. But crucially, he was sending secret reports back to London. He warned about the likelihood of a Russian threat to India, and he specifically pinpointed Kabul and Herat, saying it would be just as dangerous for Kabul to fall into Russian hands as Herat. Those are the key gateways.
And this is where the human cost really starts to mount up, leading to some terrible events.
It really does. You had diplomatic clashes like the Vixen Affair in 36, this ship trying to run a Russian blockade, fueled by this anti-Russian fervor from David Urquhart. Britain backed down that time. But then came the Siege of Herat, 1837-38. A British officer, Lieutenant Eldred Pottinger, disguised, got into the city. He basically rallied the defense against the Persians who were being helped by Russian advisors.
Pottinger again, the same one from the earlier journey.
No, wait, Eldred Pottinger. A different Pottinger, but just as brave. He was credited with saving Herat, which was seen as the key western gate to Afghanistan. But that success was immediately followed by a really catastrophic decision by the British. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1838. Lord Auckland, the Governor-General in India, pushed this policy. They decided to put their own guy, Shah Shuja, back on the throne in Kabul. He was deeply unpopular.
That sounds like asking for trouble.
It was. Auckland used some pretty deceptive reasons to justify it. The invasion itself faced huge problem supplies, attacks by tribesmen, and just this simmering resentment building up in Kabul against the British occupation.
And the situation in Kabul, it just spiraled, didn't it? Leading to absolute disaster.
Complete disaster. Sir Alexander Burns, Bokhar Burns, he was murdered in November 1841. A mob attacked his house. Apparently, a man who promised to lead him to safety actually denounced him. Horrific. That murder was like the spark. It led directly to the catastrophe, the massacre during the retreat from Kabul in the winter of 1841-42. Utter incompetence, terrible leadership, led to the almost total annihilation of the British force. We're talking 16,000 people, soldiers, families, camp followers cut in the snows and passes.
16,000.
Almost all of them. Just one man, Dr. Bryden, famously made it through to Jalalabad, a single survivor. It was a shocking, traumatic event for Britain. And Hopkirk notes the lingering suspicion, even then, that Russian agents might have been stirring things up behind the scenes, encouraging the uprising. It cast a very long, dark shadow.
So after that absolute horror show in Afghanistan, Britain pulls back, adopts this policy of masterly inactivity. What did that actually mean compared to the disastrous forward policy?
Well, masterly inactivity was basically the opposite of the aggressive forward policy that led to the Afghan invasion. It meant, let's hold the line that we have, consolidate our existing frontiers in India, and not go looking for trouble beyond them. It was seen as cheaper, definitely less risky after the Afghan experience. So Britain focused inward, securing Sindh in 1843, and then the Punjab after the Sikh Wars in 1849. Pushing their border west, but consolidating rather than adventuring further.
Okay, so Britain plays defense for a bit. What about the Russians? Were they being inactive too?
Not a chance. While Britain was consolidating, Russia was making major moves. You had Count Nikolai Ignatiev pulling off what Hopkirk calls a Machiavellian performance with the Treaty of Peking in 1860. He basically tricked the Chinese into giving Russia huge territory safaris, plus exclusive trading rights, a massive diplomatic coup, and then in Central Asia, General Cherniev grabbed Tashkent in 1865. His methods were pretty brutal, fierce assault, executing defenders. His troops ran riot afterwards. It showed the relentless, often harsh reality of the Russian advance.
So the board is shifting again. Rawlinson, a key British strategist, commented on this in 1865. What was his main point? How is the game changing?
Rawlinson saw that, yes, Britain had advanced its Indian frontiers, but Russia hadn't been idle. They had solidified their grip on the Caucasus, pushed deep into Central Asia, and crucially, their communications were improving fast. They had railways getting closer. This meant Russia could potentially move troops towards Persia or Afghanistan much faster than before. The strategic challenge for Britain was actually growing, not shrinking.
Right. The game intensifies again, and intelligence becomes even more critical. How did Britain step up its spying game in this later period?
This is where the pundits come in, really ingenious stuff. The Survey of India trained these local Indian hillmen. They went deep into uncharted territory, Tibet, Turkestan disguised as pilgrims or traders, and they measured distances by counting their steps using modified rosary beads. And they hid notes inside prayer wheels, compasses, and thermometers tucked away in hollow walking staves. They mapped thousands of square miles this way, totally undercover. Incredible. At the same time, Britain was trying to open up places like Kashgar in Chinese Turkestan. Robert Shaw led a mission there for trade, but it was dangerous. Another explorer, George Hayward, went missing there around 1870. Shaw actually risked his own safety trying to negotiate Hayward's release, but Hayward was murdered. It shows the risks these guys took.
And the Russian advances continued throughout the 1870s, didn't they? Closing the gap.
Oh, yes. Big moves. They conquered Khiva in 1873. It was a major coordinated military operation from three sides. General Kaufman marched in triumphantly after the Khan fled. Then in 1875, they took Kokand, another Central Asian Khanate, and turned it into the province of Fergana. And it's interesting, Hopkirk points out how Russian accounts later claim they were the sole liberators of slaves in Khiva, kind of ignoring any prior British diplomatic efforts on that front, controlling the narrative.
And this is also when Captain Burnaby does his famous ride?
That's right, Frederick Burnaby's ride to Khiva in 1875-76. He managed to dodge Russian patrols, got there, got back, and wrote this hugely popular book about it. It was very anti-Russian in tone, and it really fueled public anxiety back in Britain about the Russian threat getting closer and closer.
So tensions keep rising until the 1880s when things nearly boiled over into actual war. What happened?
The flashpoint was the Panjdeh incident in 1885. Russia had its eyes on Merv, a strategic oasis. They advanced troops towards Panjdeh, which was seen as a key Afghan outpost on the route to Herat. The Russian commander, Komarov, was very aggressive, clashed directly with Afghan troops. For a while, it looked like Britain and Russia were genuinely on the brink of war. Mobilization started on both sides. It was incredibly tense. This period also saw the railway race. Russia was building the Trans-Caspian Railway, pushing eastwards at speed. George Curzon, who became a major figure later, saw this railway as a massive strategic threat. He calculated it would allow Russia to concentrate maybe 100,000 troops near Afghanistan or Persia very quickly. And Curzon had this interesting take on Russia's goal. He didn't think they necessarily wanted to conquer India itself. His view, as Hopkirk relates, was that Russia wanted to keep England quiet in Europe by keeping her employed in Asia. Use Central Asia as leverage, basically, a strategic distraction.
That's a really sharp insight from Curzon. So, faced with this railway threat and the near war at Panjdeh, how did Britain respond? Did they ramp up their own efforts?
They definitely did. A key figure was MacGregor, who helped set up a proper, organized British intelligence department based in Simla, the summer capital of India. He even wrote this secret handbook, The Defense of India. It laid out scenarios for a Russian invasion. He predicted 95,000 troops coming from multiple directions. And he called for a huge buildup of the Indian army, more railways, more roads.
So, preparing for the worst. And individuals continued to play key roles, right? Like Francis Younghusband.
Yes, Younghusband, who was actually Robert Shaw's nephew, became a really important player in the later stages. He did major explorations in the Pamir Mountains, that high plateau where empires met. He had these face-to-face encounters with Russian officers, like the formidable Captain Kronchevsky. Later, he had a direct confrontation with a Colonel Yanov, who basically ordered him out of the Pamirs.
Expelled him.
Exactly. That incident caused uproar back in London. It felt like a direct challenge. General Roberts, the British CNC in India, famously declared, "We are ready, and they are not." There was this feeling that Britain actually had the edge militarily at that moment. And Britain did take offensive action too. There was a secret expedition in 1891 against the rulers of Hunza and Nagar up in the Karakoram Mountains. It involved some incredible fighting, like Gurkhas scaling this near-vertical cliff to take a fort, led by Lieutenant Manners Smith, who won the Victoria Cross for it. Really daring stuff. And then the whole Chitral affair, 1892 to 95. A disputed succession, a British agent besieged in Chitral Fort, desperate situation. It led to this dramatic race for Chitral, two British relief columns competing to get there first. One led by Colonel Kelly, marching through incredibly deep snow over high passes. It really captured the high-stakes drama of the era.
Wow. So after all that conflict, espionage, near misses, how did this great game finally wind down? Was it a treaty, a battle?
It wasn't really one single event, more of a gradual resolution. But diplomacy played the key part initially. The Pinner Boundary Agreement in 1895 was a big step. What they did was create this deliberately narrow strip of Afghan territory, the Wakhan Corridor, specifically to ensure that British India's border and the Russian Empire's border never actually touched. A buffer zone.
Ever. Keep them separated.
Exactly. Then, in 1898, George Curzon, the guy with the strong views on Russian intentions, becomes Viceroy of India. He was determined to push back against any Russian influence, seeing them as aiming for dominance across Asia. He was kind of the last great player of the old game.
But maybe the final act, the thing that really changed the whole equation, happened somewhere else entirely, far away from Central Asia.
That's exactly right. The game changer was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Russia suffered absolutely devastating defeats. Port Arthur, Mukden, and especially the naval battle at Tsushima Straits, where their fleet was annihilated. Hopkirk says it destroyed forever the Tsar's dreams of expanding his empire in the Far East. This crushing defeat, this national humiliation plus growing problems at home, suddenly made Russia much more willing to find an agreement with Britain. They needed stability.
So weakness forced their hand.
Pretty much. It led directly to the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. This was the big one. They formally sat down and hammered out their long-standing differences in Asia. They defined spheres of influence. Britain acknowledged Russia's interest in northern Persia. Russia acknowledged Britain's in the south and Afghanistan, and they agreed to stay out of Tibet. That convention really marks the formal drawing to a close of the Great Game, as Hopkirk describes it. The rivalry cooled as new threats, particularly Germany and Europe, started to emerge.
So we've covered nearly a century of this intense rivalry, amazing stories of endurance, terrible tragedies. Looking back across Hopkirk's whole narrative, what's a key takeaway for you?
For me, it's partly the sheer, almost unbelievable audacity and personal sacrifice of the individuals involved, both sides, British and Russian. These people heading into the unknown, risking everything. But also that insight, maybe best articulated by Curzon, that the game wasn't necessarily about Russia actually planning to march in and conquer India. It was often more about leverage, about keeping Britain worried and occupied in Asia to gain advantage elsewhere, particularly in Europe, strategic maneuvering on a global scale.
And tracing it back, like Hopkirk does, to that deep-seated Russian fear of encirclement from centuries ago, and seeing how events in Europe constantly ripple outwards to affect these remote regions is quite a lesson in interconnected history.
Definitely. And it underlines how much rested on diplomacy, on espionage, but also how easily miscalculation or misunderstanding could bring these massive empires right to the edge of war, a constant balancing act.
So for us, for you listening, thinking about this whole complex struggle laid out by Hopkirk, what should we take away?
Maybe consider this. How much do the echoes of that great game, the competition for influence, for resources, the strategic importance of Central Asia, the volatility of the region, how much do those echoes still shape geopolitics today? Think about current events, alliances, conflicts. You might see the patterns, the continuation of the game just playing out in new ways. It never really ended, did it? It just changed form.